Hello and welcome to episode 2 of our 2001 Kyosho Ultima RB restoration from RC Empire. Now in our last episode we went over a full introduction to this awesome little buggy with some history, background, a quick unboxing and inspection of this second-hand classic model which was in quite a state and ready for a full strip down and restoration, as well as needing a new fuel tank and a rear right hand drive shaft. In this episode we will be going through a couple of pictures of the main restoration and then walking through the final part of the assembly of the brake system, fitting the electronics, fuel tank and engine and everything else needed to finish off this part of the restoration. Now, like lots of old models and most Kyoshos, this really wasn't a difficult restoration. Every part on this buggy was easy to get to, remove and replace, which makes maintenance really easy. As you remember from the first video, this buggy was really grubby. It looks like it had never been cleaned in its life and had been sitting in someone's garage for years. So we decided to give it a full strip down. This involved starting from front to back, taking sections off of the chassis, unscrewing arms, servos and control boxes, and with a brush and some very soapy water, scrubbing, cleaning and rinsing everything down and letting it dry. Then reassembling everything back onto the chassis. The trick with this and what I like to do is take it apart in small sections at a time and make sure you know which screws and which parts go back where. Because what I have found with some models is that wrong screws have been used to tap into the plastic, so that specific screw will work okay in that hole, but if you go to put in a different screw with a different thread or even the correct one which should have been in there in the first place, it won't grip and you might even damage or loosen the plastic thread. So I want to try and use the same screw that came out of that hole or an identical one. We also took the shocks off, opened them up, took them apart and cleaned them up because there was a lot of grit around them which wears away at the shafts and damages the seals. Luckily not a single shock on this was leaking, and after a good clean up they came up looking amazing with those gold tops. What we also did was use engine degreaser on some of the really stubborn grime and on the plastic of the wheels to really brighten them up. Make absolutely sure though that you wash every trace of the degreaser away before you go to re-grease and reassemble anything together, because you don't want a few drops of degreaser getting into your diffs or somewhere which needs to be lubricated and melting the lubricant away without you knowing. It is really strong stuff and I only use it where I know I can wipe it off and clean it without leaving any of it sitting on the chassis. But as you can see, the whole buggy has come up looking amazing. It is completely different to the one we saw out the box. We have also managed to get a replacement right rear drive shaft from America and the fuel tank, which you will see later on in this video. What we are going to do now, and what I wanted to show you, because it's always interesting to see how older models are put together, is the assembly of the brake system, spur gear and the rest of the model. Now these here are the original parts. So coming straight out from the gearbox, we have this keyed shaft which holds the brake and spur gear assembly. Straight above that we have the brake lever, the brake piston and the two brake pads that run across the front of the piston, which we'll see in action later on. Now what you want to do is get the mounting drum of the brake disc, put the disc over it, and this locks in place on the shaft with a little pin. So now the disc will always spin at the same RPM as the shaft because it's fixed in place. Now get your two brake pads and sandwich the discs between them. And you just want to screw the pads in just to keep them in place. Make sure that when you screw them down completely, you don't squash the discs, because the discs need to spin freely until the brakes are applied, and you can adjust this later on. Now you can see the shaft will move freely until the brake lever moves. It rotates the vertical rod which pushes the brass piston out, pushes onto the brake pads and applies the brakes to the discs which are fixed onto the shaft. So next we want to install the spur gear. Now this has a slipper clutch on it with a clutch pad on either side. So there were two pink cardboard pads which can wear however much they want because they are super cheap. And there is a metal friction plate on the outside of that. Note as you put these on, the metal friction plate is keyed. So it's got a rectangular hole that locks in place on the shaft, whereas the spur gear has a round hole in the middle and can spin freely. The only thing locking this into place is the force of the friction of the clutch plates. and this force is determined by how tight you do this nut up. So put the spur gear on, put the second clutch plate on, and put the clutch plate holder, which is also keyed. Put the spring on, which applies the pressure to this plate, and tighten up the nut. If you tighten this up as much as you physically can, then the clutch won't work as it should, and if the rear wheels suddenly lock up, all that power from the engine will be transferred through the gears and the drivetrain, instead of the friction plates being able to lose friction with the clutch plate and start spinning, reducing the load that's been transferred into the drivetrain. And that's it. Next, put your brake lever in, which will connect to the servo. And that's it. We are now ready for a quick installation of the electronic boxes, servos and fuel tank. And luckily I have the whole section pre-assembled. So on here we have the throttle, steering servo and the receiver. So mount the steering servo and make sure you know where the center is before you attach the steering horn. Otherwise you'll have to take it off again. And attach it with the 2 screws from the bottom. Then link up your brake lever, make sure that the hook is in the right way around. On this car the hook should go in from the bottom of the servo and not from the top, as you can see here, because you will get interference with the throttle linkage which crosses above it. So just make sure the linkages and arms are free to move as they should. With this done, screw the whole control box onto the chassis from the underneath. And you can see it's nice and secure. Now you can see the throttle linkage should go over the brake lever, but we've put it on upside down and it doesn't quite fit. So we need to swap that around. Now with this sorted, it's time to fit the powerhouse, the Kyosho GX-15 engine, and this really did come up looking amazing. There were a few scratches on the top of it where the buggy had flipped over, but it's cleaned up real nicely, and opening it up inside it didn't look too bad either. In the 4th episode we will be doing our first fire up of this engine on video, so I hope it works, and using 3 screws secure it in place and mesh the pinion to the spur gear. You can also use a little dab of Loctite on the engine screws just to make sure they don't vibrate loose. With the engine in place, you can tighten up this little arm here which holds the power cable from the battery in the rear to the receiver in the front. And finally, we can fit on our brand new fuel tank, which I found quite easily for around £15. And this should come with new screws, which I've already screwed into the plastic holes and made a thread. And I think these normally come untapped, but position it. And again, screw it in from the bottom. Connect your fuel lines, the green one from the bottom of the tank feeding into the carburetor. And maybe you can feed this in from under the exhaust and round up to the carburetor if you wanted. Get your return hose and stick it into the exhaust. And make sure nothing is trapped or clamped closed. And that's it. This was the mechanical chassis restoration done for the 2001 Kyosho Ultima RB, and it looks fantastic. I can see this being a real fun buggy to bash around on road and off road. Quickly, in case you wanted to know, this weighs in at 1.387 kilograms, which is very light. Okay, there's no battery in it at the moment, but compare that to the 2001 Kyosho Pure 10 Alpha, which is 1.53 kilograms. It is 148 grams difference, and you have the GX-15 engine in the buggy versus the smaller GX-12 engine in the Pure 10. So this buggy should be real nippy and fun to throw around. And that's it. In the next episode, we're going to be stripping down and respraying the original body and wing for this buggy and making it look factory fresh, so keep an eye out for that. I hope you have enjoyed and seen a few new things. Drop us a comment or an email if you have any questions or want to see anything else, and please rate and subscribe. Thank you for watching and see you soon.